While most newspapers and magazines across the country have followed the EC guidelines, media experts are divided on whether opinion and exit polls should be banned during an election period. The EC directive, however, raises other issues linked to the ban. For instance, the apprehension that opinion polls could influence voting patterns during an election period. How far is it justified? But in a democracy, stratospheric promises and electrifying rhetoric is perhaps the only lexicon deployed by political parties to woo the masses. To tell the huge electorate that they really mean business, that many of their stated intentions, though lofty, could translate into reality if voted to power. Manifestos, in a general sense, could mislead the voter as much as they provide a broad focus of a political and economic agenda.
Cynicism has developed that politicians do not keep up their promises, and therefore the faith of people in manifestos is going down. But that is not the way it should be. The parties must be bound within the political discipline of their manifestos, because that's a solemn assurance on which they seek their votes.
Unfortunately, for many of the parties, the manifestos have lost meaning. But like there are people and people, there are parties and parties. I mean, there are some parties who take the manifesto seriously.
Don't forget that the public is much more aware today. You know, the manifesto is discussed much more on TV, in the press. The public is much more aware. So there is greater sense of pressure on political parties to deliver. There is a certain greater sense of accountability. But I think this pressure also has to come from within. You know, political parties also must realize that, you know, after all, manifesto is a document that they have prepared, and that they must try and fulfill most of those promises that they have made.
General elections 1998 has been no different as far as utopian dreams and gung-ho declarations go. But a closer look at the manifestos point out that while issues like law and order, economic reforms, rising prices, women's rights have been given a cursory treatment, many pole-vaulting promises have been made without weighing the economic and social costs.
Populism should not be allowed to become an instrument of manifesto making. Manifestos must be reasonable. They must reflect within a reasonable framework what parties can achieve within the period for which they are elected.
Everybody can, make these promises. But the question is, which one of these manifestos or which one of these political parties at least possesses that direction and the political will to do so?
The BJP manifesto comes very close to the reality of what the BJP can target for its achievement.
We have not said that government will set up all this capacity. A part of this capacity will come in the government sector, in the public sector. Part of this capacity will come through private power projects. What we have said is the country needs 7,000 megawatts of power at least per year. Perhaps through the government and public investment, we may be able to add about 4,000 megawatts, which leaves a gap of about 3,000 megawatts, which has to be fulfilled through private investment.
The question of health, education, food security, I mean, all these things we are now arguing for a more direct and more decisive state intervention based on a certain amount of resource backing, which will have to be raised through the alternate sources that we had listed out there. Now, whether it is feasible to do that or not, well, that is essentially the struggle, so to speak.
While experts may dismiss most manifestos as nothing more than well-meaning pamphlets, party managers maintain that many of the populist measures listed out in the documents do metamorphose into action.
Look at N.T. Ramarao. He promised 2 rupees a kilo rice when he was out of power. He delivered 2 rupees a kilo. He said that. You look at him the second time around. He said, I will impose prohibition when I come into power. He imposed prohibition. So it is not as if parties do not implement. I mean, look at the Janata Dal in 1989. They promised to implement the Mandal Commission report, and they implemented the Mandal Commission report. So political parties, are responsible actors. Don't make political parties to be out like film actors and giving filmy dialogues in their manifestos.
Past experience shows that while some leaders did manage to implement a few of their promised populist schemes, but as there is always hope in the human mind, the average Indian today awaits the coming of better days, when all such populist promises would be fulfilled, even as he casts his verdict for a government of his choice.